Thank you so much, Dr. Kazemi, for a very intriguing talk and topic. I think with that, we will just open it to questions. Please feel free to just raise your hand using the raise a hand function found in reactions at the bottom, or you can type your question in the chat section. Any questions? Yes, I believe that's Pune, if I'm not mistaken, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're
Go ahead.
smart. Good, great to see you. You look great.
Thank you. Good to see you too.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a black tile. I'd rather remain as such. That's what my students do, and I'm not very happy, but I'm guilty of charge. In any case, this is a wonderful lecture on many levels. However, I'm going to ask my questions, which is not film related quite, but in terms of translation of these terms.
Okay.
How would you translate the terms uncanny, Gothic, and weird into Persian? Thank you.
Okay, Gothic. All right. That's a good question. I mean, you know, as I said, in the word weird is a word that can have various valences. So I think that you can, you know, translate weird as ajib, because the various valences of weird has to do with the strange, you know, as the mode is, right? As theorized by Fisher as well. And also weird, ajib is important because, you know, again, ajib và gharib are these kind of two terms together, have this long history, as I said. So for me, ajib is a good translation of weird. And I've provided certain reasons why I think that is. For Gothic, I don't think there is a proper translation. You would have to transliterate it into Persian, you know. And uncanny, I don't think there's a, you know, it's a German word, unheimlich. So I think that that also would be best to transliterate into Persian. And then you can create certain and discuss certain aspects of, let's say, literary and, let's say, mythic and folkloric aspects that have this element of the unheimlich and have the aspects of, let's say, the Gothic. And so, you know, even though we don't have the term, the genre, let's say, of Gothic the way we conceive of it, but it has, you know, Gothic post, you know, development of the Gothic genre influences Persian literature. So, for example, obviously, you know, Sadegh Hedayat, for example. And I argue that Sadegh Hedayat's work is also a kind of permeating influence into aspects of this development that we have seen, you know, particularly in some of these, not just Sadeghi, but particularly Hedayat as well, who was fascinatingly interested in Iranian folklore. So,
sorry, I forgot to ask, what about Iri? How would you translate Iri into Persian?
Yeah, so Iri, again, I correlated it to, yeah, Iri again I correlate Iri to Gharib. But these are more kind of, it's not an exact translation, right? So there's a poetic license in that translation, obviously. But there are resonances why, again, the weird and the eerie can be correlated to Ajib và Gharib, because often when you look at Mark Fisher's deployment, and also the word weird itself has to go back, it goes back to Shakespeare, the Weird Sisters, right? So there's an occult element, supernatural element also to the weird, let's say, right? And the word ajib in relationship as well as qarib, these also go back and have relationship to these occult phenomena, various forms of the occult sciences, and these appear in both the folkloric and then perhaps also within the more what is considered, let's say, folk magic, but also higher magic. So these distinctions are not necessarily always correct, but let's call it literate magic, magic that has been produced by scholars, or works of magic or occult sciences related to that. So, but within the literature, there are, the Book of Wonders. The Book of Wonders is also important because it evokes these ajib, the wonders of the world, right? The strange aspects of the world, right? So these Book of Wonders, which also are related to the Hazar Afsan or the 1001 Nights, so those are fiction narratives, but then these are supposedly historical narratives. But these historical narratives evoke these aspects of the world and the wonders of nature, let's say, those, this sense of the strangeness or the weirdness of the world. And of course, these books try to say that this is the wonder of God's creation that is, belies our understanding or comprehension and so on. So certain aspects of that heritage of the Book of Wonders, the 1001 Nights, I think are evocative of a literary heritage that has contributed both in the East and the West. So in Iran, these texts would have influenced, aspects of Iranian culture and literature, obviously. But then, particularly 1001 Nights has influenced Western literary productions. As I said, some of the romantics and the Gothic, literature that has been influenced by. But nevertheless, we don't have those specific terms like Gothic and or unheimlich, or in Persian. I would think that the best would be to probably transliterate them.
Just to add what you said, Farshid Jan, so Dr. Pune actually wrote a comment for you. Thank you. I appreciate your response and really enjoyed your talk. Weird comes from the Old English word weird, meaning destiny, as far as I have heard. And we have another question in the chat section. So it's by Dr. Khosrow Shahi, and I'm going to read it for you.
Okay.
Thanks so much for such a rich talk and for inviting us into the realm of Iranian horror film. You refer to examples made both in Iran and outside. Can you discuss how films made in Iran and those in the diaspora are in conversation, if they are, especially in relation to your central argument around horror films and post-2009?
Okay.
So those made in Iran and made outside Iran, are they in conversation with one another?
Yes.
Is the question.
Yes.
And if they are, how are they in conversation with one another, especially based on this argument you have that they have many elements that relate to the 2009 socio-political climate?
Yeah. So some of the films that I discuss, like, they themselves are, like, the director will say that certain elements of Iranian films have contributed to not just Western films. Like, so for example, Under the Shadow by Babak Anvari, he's also stated that some Iranian horror films, in the post-revolutionary period, were inspirational, aside from other films like Iranian films, like by other well-known directors, and then of course well-known Western directors and films of horror genre. So he's saying that there's a pool of inspiration that allowed him to create that, and also his cultural heritage in Iran, right? His upbringing, early upbringing, and in Iran, and the memories of that, which contributed to making this film. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is also a little bit combination of these things, in the sense that she is in various ways, obviously using Iranian cultural heritage to try to evoke a kind of fabulated, Iranian horror, but she, so using the chador already brings that heritage. But what's interesting with her also, she also wants to certain critiques. So she's in conversation, let's say, to give you a direct example, with that film, there is a critique of certain aspects of female sexuality and autonomy and agency, but also transsexuality, transgender, and queerness. So she's critiquing those aspects of Iranian culture that persecute non-normative genders and sexualities, particularly with the rockabilly character, who is a trans figure, who is cross-dressing in the film and is pervasive throughout the film, is a silent figure that in a way is commenting on these aspects of Iranian culture at this period, and the way it treats non-conforming genders and sexualities. So there's these conversations that are being had, and of course the Iranian government had a very allergic reaction to that film in particular, because it was a chador-clad, black-veiled figure, and they even had an actual figure who is kind of like a state critic, going in, writing and appearing on television, try to argue against this film, saying that this film is completely trying to portray Iran in such a negative way, and so on, and bad city is Iran, and so on. And so it's very fascinating that there is this kind of a relationship. But also when she had gone to Tehran, like Anna Lily, and aspects of parts of Tehran that she saw, she tried to use aspects of California to try to evoke that part of Tehran. So there is a conscious relationship between homeland and diaspora, right? That's why I call, for example, particularly her film, an accented cinema, in relationship to Nafisi's theorization of accented cinema, even though it fits in some ways and not in every other way to his categorization of accented cinema. And then I would say that also, in a way, that another diasporic film is The Night. So The Night is also in conversation, perhaps even more in some ways than the other two, because the director is going back to Iran. He's actually from Iran, but they shot the film out here, out in America. So that film is in conversation with what is going on in the political, social sphere in Iran. But one of the things that film, so that again, the post-2009 political sphere. Now, these three films, right? I'm putting them as diasporic examples of that, of this post-2009 Iranian society, because I think they do have that relationship to what is happening in Iran. Because they go, as I said, particularly Night has gone. So the entire Iran is again conceived of as night. That that hotel itself that they cannot escape is Iran. So there are these again symbolic political resonances, And another dimension is that appears in that film, like, as I said, the doppelgangers, the double, right? Remember I said that, you know, those are some of the motifs that appear in these films. That appears in this film. And again, that's an aspect of, you know, kind of the Janus face society of Iran, where there's a private and the public, and the private is completely in this discord from the largely from the public, right? So this kind of disjunction between our public face and our private lives. And so there's many elements to be theorized in relationship to each of those films, of course, that can be shown to have a relationship to a post-2009 society. And some of them, of course, can even show aspects of those issues and problematics a little bit more that then it can be shown from the indigenous production in Iran. So from the films that are being produced itself in Iran. So there's a bit more freedom with those films that are being obviously shot outside of Iran, and then less freedom in the ones that are being shown in Iran, and therefore the not showing of violence in particular, graphic violence in particular in those films. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure if I did it justice.
Okay, so we have actually a couple of other questions, and I have my own questions,
Okay.
but I will first go into the questions that are in the chat section. There is a common question. You can choose whether you want to respond to it, because it's not necessarily about horror cinema in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
I have been, so this is a question by Zainab Marvi. I have been lately investigating Pakistani horror cinema, but there have barely been any films made in this genre in my country, and it makes me wonder why that is the case. Is it because the public is very superstitious and considers watching such films about jinns a bad omen? And so I would like to know, how are these new wave Iranian horror films perceived by mainstream audience in Iran? So actually the last part of the question is something you could respond to.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Seen by the audience, mainstream audience in Iran.
Who asked this question?
Zainab Marvi.
Zainab Marvi. Ki hale? Tige? Ham biya chahe. I lived in Pakistan for 2 years, so I can speak Urdu and understand Urdu and read Urdu. And it's a beautiful language, and a wonderful culture. But because I've been away, I can't comment, obviously on the production of films in Pakistan. So I will have to take up, the part of the question towards the end, which is related to Iran. So can you repeat that? I'm sorry, go back for at least the last part of it.
It's no problem. So what is the reaction or response of the mainstream audience in Iran to these horror films that are shown in Iran?
Okay, yes. Yeah, that's an important point, because again, audience is an important aspect of genre and audience expectation. But what's fascinating is that actually, there is a great audience in Iran, and there is a great thirst for these films. And particularly, I think that it became through Shahram Mokri's first film, so Fish and Cat, who really had a huge impact, particularly the younger generation really resonated with that film, right? And so after that, I think there's more a growing sense of enjoyment in relationship to horror films. But again, as I said, certain films don't meet the expectations of the audiences and are failures at the box office and in terms of audience movie going. But some films are very successful. So, for example, we know that The Night was very successful in Iran when it was shown again. And as far as I've heard, Zalava is being received well again by Iranians. So there are indications from what I've read, you know, it's kind of there's an excitement even now growing that Iranians are starting to produce more sophisticated, more technically sound horror films, though not quite horror. And some of these people are even like these kind of like even like state critics again, right? Like, you know, I consider Masoud Farasati, whom I vehemently dislike, a state critic, and he recently also had a kind of, again, in his little show that he has about films in Iran and so on, and they had a discussion also on Zalava. But what's fascinating is that so again, it's getting you know, more traction, and there is audiences for it, and you know, I think that the Iranian people are fascinated. I know a little bit about other cultures that are also having a resurgence of horror. So, for example, Turkey is interesting. It's also very fascinating in terms of the new developments in horror that are emerging in the 2010s, particularly. If you watch a Turkish movie that I would recommend, has certain resonances with the Iranian style of filmmaking at this period, it's called Antenna. So if you watch Antenna, the movie Antenna is a very incredibly fascinating film that uses, again, horror tropes in relationship as the way I theorize it, commenting on this kind of claustrophobic, you know, menacing atmosphere of the culture, and alluding to, you know, Erdogan's, you know, heavy-handed treatment of you know, the population and their, you know, grievances at what is happening with the, you know, again, the intellectuals and so on, and the artists in Turkey. So it's interesting to see if they are if you know, there's a conversation even having within the region, right? So that is a fascinating discussion in itself.
So there's another question by Dr. Kaveh Askari in the chat section. Thanks for an exciting talk. It takes a lot of work to build a filmography like this and make a case for it as a phenomenon. I wanted to ask about the role of prestige in contemporary horror cinema in Iran. You start with Fish and Cat, a film that announces itself as a prestige film with its single take structure. Is it important that many of these horror films are prestige horror films rather than borrowing from the B film traditions that are also an important part of the genre?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a distinction that can be shown between some of the art or prestige films that are emerging, like the ones from Mokri and others, which I think, again, Zalava is striving to be a prestige film, Night is striving to be a prestige or art film within the horror genre. And then there's the kind of B or more popular films that, as I said, are indigenous to Iran. They don't have pretensions to be, let's say, you know, festival films, and they remain within the Iranian context and are only shown in Iran. So, but nevertheless, what's fascinating is that the two of them still are part and parcel of the emerging trend of horror, because both the B film productions and the prestige or art productions are proliferating. So it's not only the prestige films that are emerging, but also the kind of lower quality or B films that are gaining traction. And so they are still finding their audiences in Iran. Like, for example, Zar. Zar, in a way, is, you know, has some pretensions to a prestige film, but it did not have an audience properly outside of Iran, and so on. So what was the end of the question?
Is it important that many of these horror films are prestige horror films rather than borrowing from the B film traditions that are also an important part of the genre? So I guess you kind of responded to the
Yeah.
fact that the prestige does have a, some impact on how they're received both inside and outside Iran.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. And I think that again, because of Mokri, I think that trajectory is trying to make these kind of prestige or art films, but some of them again they don't get given a chance to be even shown, and so for example, Pust or the movie Skin, that's a fascinating film to look at in terms of its production and audience and what happened. That movie was stalled and was never given a chance to be properly seen in Iran. But it's an actually high quality, it can be considered an almost prestige film, but it had a lot of problems in its production, because first of all it was made in Turkish, and so there was all these issues that Ershad and the government was unhappy with, and the film has not been given a proper due, in my opinion. And it may eventually find an audience, but it has not, for example. So, but yes, the prestige ones I think, have more importance, but the B movies, or the more indigenous ones that are within the Iranian context, are also appearing in terms of the popularity of the genre. So the growing popularity of the genre is making both of these, the art house, or let's say the prestige films with the higher production values and so on, and also the lower B quality films.
So I'm going to ask actually a question that I have, and
thank you so much.
It kind of has to do with the previous question about genre and about what actually led you to collect these films and as a phenomenon, as the new horror film. And the question actually has to do with this title, the new horror film or the new horror cinema in Iran. So I wanted to know, you actually do talk about what is new within this new genre that has emerged. So I want to know, what are some of the characteristics, if your research actually does attend to that, of pre-2009 horror films? And are there particular events in the history of even post-revolutionary Iran, let's say, that have an impact on horror films of the era, and in a way that those films can be differentiated from the post-2009 ones?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you. The reason I think that I noticed these differences, it kind of happened accidentally during my researches that I was doing in my postdoctoral period. And then I started looking at films in the pre-revolutionary period, and I was looking at these new films, particularly, some of the prestige films, and then some of the diasporic films, right? And so then I noticed certain, obviously, differences. And then also I noticed that I felt like there's a new audience, a growing audience that is emerging. So, and this new trend is partly related to audience reception, and that audience reception has allowed more filmic production. That's one thing that has happened in terms of number. So in the pre-revolutionary period, we have had horror films, right? But most of them, no, not pre-revolution. Let's talk about pre-2009, right? So pre-2009, we've had, certainly from the revolution onwards, we've had horror films, but almost none of them are prestige films, or as Kavajan says. So none of them are really art films, except perhaps one, in my opinion, and that's Teles, by Dariush. I forget the name, but Susan Taslimi is in that film, and an incredibly important performance in that film. Again, I think it's one of her last films in Iran. So that I would say is a partially prestige film. Again, that film was stifled because again, people, the government was again with, that film has a Beizai-esque, kind of quality, and of course Susan Taslimi was in it, and so the government did not really like that film, and there was a lot of production issues for that film to be shown eventually, and so on. But there are other films that, for example, that showed certain as qualities, like that appear in this new kind of movement, or the new Iranian horror. But so those are, let's say, certain aspects of folk horror, like jinns, right? But because jinn is so predominant in terms of that aspect, because it's part of the indigenous culture of Iran, so that we can kind of go to it much more easily by evoking a supernatural horror that is indigenous to our culture and region. It's something that they have in common. So you have aspects of jinn in the pre-revolutionary period, aspects of it in the 2009 period, before 2009, so from the revolution to even up to 2009. So the girls' dormitory is an important one, for example, that again uses the jinn, and others that often use aspects of this supernatural horror. And in the pre-revolutionary period, you have the great Samuel Khachikian. Scholars have discussed this here and there, but again, his output is probably the most important, that deals with aspects of particularly a kind of, again, combination of Western influenced genre and films, like German expressionism, film noir, and Hitchcock, for example, from the West, but then also indigenous elements in terms of religious and cultural and folkloric and mythic, like, for example, Shab Neshini, that Jahannam is like, that film it has this combination of elements that have both the Western and Eastern. So, and in a way you could say, again, these are hybrid. So he did play with hybrid genres again. So there were horror elements, but they were not pure horror, right? So, and then you had, in the pre-revolutionary period, you also had, still even coming from the first Pahlavi into the second Pahlavi, you did have kind of these horror films. Some of them, again, are B films, and they get forgotten about largely. And then some of them can be seen anew if you look at them in a new context. So, for example, in my book, I very quickly gesture to the cow as having an actual horror element that has been completely gone, because everyone always focuses on the neo-realist dimension of that film, but it's neo-Gothic and horror, psychological horror, and then also its evocation of aspects of Iranian culture as well, but also within the Western dimension as well. Because Ghulam Hossein Saidi, who is the writer of that story, was a trained psychiatrist, and he knew psychoanalysis very well. And so those elements also permeate that text, and also, of course, in a way appear in Dariush Mehjoui's film. But this invisible threatening atmosphere, and that film has, in a way, a pre-revolutionary correlation in some way to some of these films that I think are basically. So if there is a few films in the pre-revolutionary period that are alluding to a kind of using horror elements to comment on the political atmosphere, Mehjoui's is one, right? And then you have that heritage. Then in the new period, you have these newer films that are, some of them are more conscious. Like, as I said, Mokri, I believe, is a more conscious director in the way that he's deploying his horror tropes and motifs. He's very literate both in the Iranian context and in the Western filmic tradition. And so he's able to, even though I would say that Hujum is not as successful as a film in a way, as an actual film, as Fish and Cat is in terms of its quality, but nevertheless, it still uses these political critiques that he and social political critiques of the period in Iran. So I don't know if I've answered that, but.
Yes. That was great. Actually, I do have a follow-up question. If you can just briefly talk about whether you think then, based on what you just said, which was a fascinating trajectory of, basically these elements that make horror films what they are in different periods. So would you say that, in a way, starting maybe even in pre-revolutionary era, the jinn or the invisible, like a Bakhtak style,
yes,
invisible force actually becomes a political force in the film, from even pre-revolutionary and then to the present, but of course in different ways.
Yes, I think so. There are elements of that both in the literature and in the cinematic canon, that we can see where a supernatural horror is used sometimes for political purposes, like as a critique of the political atmosphere in Iran. So, and you see it in as I said, you can see it in Sadiq Hidayat, you can see it in Saedi, you can see it in Sadiqi and others, and then you see it in figures like Mir-Djalali. And another thing that has to be interestingly analyzed is Beizai's deployment of these things, because they're not necessarily horror deployments, but they do critique the socio-political, cultural as well. And he also brings out aspects of these elements that have been again also repressed within the historical cultural identity of Iranians. So, for example, certain elements that you would see in Beizai's film that don't necessarily always have a kind of Islamic context, but they go to pre-Islamic, right? Those are elements that I think are unique to his films because they evoke kind of aspects that go out. They're pre-Islamic. So, for example, the ghostly figures, ghostly figures in Beizai's films is fascinating. No one has really analyzed it, but they go to Shahnameh and they go to another text called Memorials of Zarir, in which ghosts appear, right? So and this kind of metalapsis in which time and space is folded, and a present modern figure converses with a long dead ghost historical figure is an important aspects of a kind of aspects of a supernatural folklore, mythic heritage in the Iranian context that in his texts and cinematic texts are deployed not for reasons of horror, but for, again, he has not used the horror tropes. But nevertheless, those elements that we would consider, let's say we would today call them Gothic or what have you, they are in his work, right? But they appear within a specific so it's a specific Iranian Gothicism, in a way. And
thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for that. It's fascinating. There is one last question in the chat section, and I think maybe Dr. Tawakkoli has to tell us when the event ends, the Q&A, but maybe we have time for this last question. It kind of relates actually to what you were just saying. The question is by Mehran Divan Begizand. He asks, or he says, I get excited with horror movies, but don't know too much about theory. But a recent movie that was a horror to me was Sorkhpust, which was screened at the Smithsonian here in Washington, D.C., as by its English name, The Warden. Have you seen it? And would you consider this as a horror movie?
I haven't seen it. I heard about it, but I have to see it. And then, so again, it could, like from what I know about it, it could again be these types of hybrid genres that does not deploy the full scale of the horror genre, but nevertheless it has elements of horror, and so it has to be analyzed on its own as well to see if it would fit. First of all, it would still fit if it has aspects of the horror, but then you have to see it in terms of its content to see if there is a political deployment of the horror, right? If there's a subtext of the use of horror for political ends. If it's not, then it may not fall within this cycle of films that I've kind of put within 2009 to 2020 roughly. And by the way, Zalava, as I said, I think it's more about kind of a critique of superstition, perhaps, right? So a critique of superstition, a critique of, this, again, this, invisible menace, which is deemed superstitious. And if that's a reading, let's say, I'm not saying it's the reading, but if that's a reading, then that does not fall within a political critique. It does not fall within the cycle of the films that I consider to be a political. And again, it's interesting that it came out of 2020. So after 2020 is 2021. So it does not necessarily fall within that 10-year decade period that I look at. So, but it continues the trend of the horror. It continues the growing desire to create prestige, more new prestige horror films, and more attention is being. So it is that, but it may not, in my opinion, there's problematics in terms of its interpretation as a political critique of the atmosphere of contemporary Iran, and its location. So again, it may have a very, let me put it this way, there's that critique of superstition and so on and so forth, but then there's also a critique in terms of a marginalized community and a critique of kind of marginalized Kurdish community within a larger dominant community, right? So the dominant Shia community, which persecutes a kind of, the marginalized Kurdish community and culture. So it may have that element, you see. So it has a cultural specificity to the Kurdish experience as well, where they would feel oppressed and persecuted by the dominant culture, and both, of it, not just the culture, but the politics as well. But it could be seen as a more specific critique rather than a more broader critique.
Thank you.
So I will look at, thank you so much. Yeah, so who asked that question? Mehran?
Mehran Divan Begizand, and he actually said that the film was wonderful and it's made by Nima Javidi. It actually depicts, if I'm not mistaken, it was based in mid-20th century Iran. I think it's depicting 1950s, and it does have an eeriness to it.
Have you seen it?
I have seen it, yes.
Okay.
But I saw it a couple of years ago, I think in 2019, so I don't remember it very well, but I do remember there was an eeriness to it. And there definitely was some political aspect to it, which you could kind of I guess, connect to.
Yeah. So I have to watch that film, and then it may go within the it may be part of this the cycle of films that I'm theorizing from, for post 2009 to up to 2020. But again,
I would even say, I mean, what you said about Zalava, it's really interesting for me, and I wonder if, based on the your presentation, actually, we will see a different formation of this genre, a different path for this genre after the 2019 protests, after the pandemic. I mean,
yes,
I think all of this will actually give rise to a different path for this genre.
The horror genre. I agree, because as I said, and even some people have, when you read some of the critical commentary, they're like, is the jinn the pandemic in Zalava, right? so already, our moment, our cultural historical moment is, having, films are appearing that are, again, because they're commenting in some ways to our particular anxieties, right, that we have. And horror films are very specific about that, in a way. In many ways, they are about those cultural, social, political, and historical anxieties at that moment, and often they have that element within them. So yeah, Zalava, I think, may be a new beginning of horror genre films in Iran, with a new emerging context.
Thank you. This was a fascinating talk and question and answer. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to give the podium back to Dr. Tawakkoli.
Well, Dr. Kazemi, thank you for your outstanding presentation.
Thank you so much, Mehdi John. Mehdi.
Impressed with your original research, and you're not just theorizing, but also, I think, with the rethinking of Gov and some of the pre-revolutionary period, you're also rehistoricizing and relabeling, involved in that relabeling of some of the films. Both Golberg and I are looking forward to your contribution to the Iranian Cinema Compendium, and look forward to reading it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Golberg John, for leading this outstanding conversation and discussion. And thank you all for your participation in this lively conversation.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Tawakkoli Taghi, and to Golberg. Thank you so much again for everything. And thank you for all of you for your kindness and your comments and your questions. They're very, very productive.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.